Thank you, Fabian, and thank you, Daniel and Roderick and the Academy have put so much work into this really interesting conference, and it's so kind of you to invite me. We've been discussing, all of us in various ways, the problem of powers and their place in nature. And I'm going to be doing that too, but I'm going to be putting a lot more emphasis on ethics than I think some other speakers have done, and on the idea of understanding what our ordinary ethical beliefs commit us to. Now, we've got a general idea, I think, of power, which I could sort of suggest comes to something like this. It's a kind of capacity, but it's not any old capacity. It's a capacity to, after all, one can have a capacity to be affected, and that looks like a capacity to be subject to power, not a power in its own right. Power is a sort of kind of capacity to produce or possibly prevent outcomes. It makes things happen. It might, even in its particularly strong cases, determine that they happen, or it might just influence whether they happen. And one very, very familiar case of power is what I'm going to call ordinary causation, or causation for short. Okay. So if I take a brick and I hurl it at a window and the window breaks, we have a very familiar case of something, the brick, or an event or occurrence involving the brick, it's hitting the window, producing an outcome. And we naturally understand that, unless we're really in the land of Hume, as involving some sort of exercise of power, force. Is all power in nature like that? And in particular, do ordinary human actions involve just that kind of power, or do they involve other kinds of power that might radically be unlike ordinary causation? Now, this question can take two forms, and I think we have to distinguish them very carefully. One is a straightforward metaphysical question about the true construction of the world. And if we think that there's only one kind of power in nature, if that, and Hume probably thought there were no powers at all, but that's controversial as an interpretation. But if you think there's just one power in nature, then the answer to this question is, well, that's all that power is. That's the true metaphysics of power. But of course, we might still, in our everyday ethical thinking, be committed to other kinds of power. And so there's a second way of understanding this question as an analytic question, not a metaphysical question, a question about the proper analysis of our ethical thought. And one of the besetting sins, I think, of the English language tradition, going back to that brilliant destroyer, Thomas Hobbes, who I'll be saying quite a bit about, has been to merge these two projects. What people do is they have some metaphysical views, which, in the case of Hobbes and many people since, are in the direction of something like naturalism, and then they read this naturalism into the account of what our ethical thought contains. And this is a most hazardous enterprise. After all, why should ordinary people automatically be naturalists in the way they think about the ethical? Other philosophers aren't. We know lots of philosophers in the past who weren't. Why should ordinary people also be paid up naturalists already? Okay. I think to be a really sort of, rigorous and consistent naturalist and think about the ethical, you've got to do some fairly careful policing and revision in the way you think. But that, at any rate, is a real possibility. And just because you don't like the look of a kind of power from a naturalist point of view, you can't disqualify it as providing the best account of the way we ordinarily think about the nature of action or about the nature of the ethical. Now, let's look a little more about action as we ordinarily understand it. And on the handout, I pick out two aspects of action or agency that in the modern English language tradition have often got merged, but which I think are clearly quite distinct. If you're thinking about action and asking what is it to perform an action, one very natural story to tell is a story about purposiveness or goal direction. When you perform an action, you are doing something as a means to attaining an end or a goal. That's the way Aristotle thinks about action in the Nicomachean Ethics. And one can think about deliberate omissions, sort of refrainings from action, negative forms of agency in a similar way. I deliberately stay very still in order to evade detection. That's not just my not doing anything. I'm involved in agency by refraining from doing something, and it's got a goal, so I remain undetected by you. And of course, some things we do for their own sake. I might just whistle a tune to myself for its own sake. But again, if it's an action, it looks as though it's going to have a purpose, the very action itself. Other things in our life, like beliefs or desires, may not have purposes. They generally don't. They're just directed to things as true or as desirable. But it looks as though actions are directed at objects as goals to be attained through the action. And that's purposiveness. And notice I've just used the word object. So we've got this relationship between the action and the object, which is a kind of goal. What is this object? Well, it looks as though it's generally just an object of thought. Okay. Now, obviously, the whole point of action is to make our goals real, to actually attain them. I set off for my Goldman Sachs job interview with the goal of working for Goldman Sachs and becoming immensely rich. And that is the object of my action. But it's just an object of my thought. I may not get through the job interview, or I may take the job with Goldman Sachs and end up with a nervous stress collapse, very poor. None of this may actually happen. It remains nothing but an object of my thought. That, of course, immediately leads us to think about action as part of a wider family of psychological occurrences, which are also object-directed, which philosophers talk about generally by appeal to the idea of intentionality. We have beliefs that are directed at objects as true, we have desires directed at objects as good or desirable, and then we have actions that are directed at objects as possibly things that are desirable, but as goals to be attained, where the attitude directed at them is occurring as some sort of means to getting to the object, okay, which needn't be true of beliefs and desires at all. Okay, and we'll come back to that way of looking at action, but it's not a silly way. In fact, it's the way right through the Middle Ages people looked at action. It's not the way modern post-Hobbesian English language philosophers look at action at all. Okay, so we've got object direction, purposiveness, and I said I was going to be talking about power. I haven't actually said anything about power yet, capacity to determine or produce outcomes in relation to purposiveness. But immediately we think about purposiveness, there's a very familiar idea of power that comes into the story, and it's motivating power. Something moves us to act. And this idea of being moved clearly seems to be the idea of something exercising a capacity to produce an outcome, which is our performance of the action. We're moved into performing the action. And what is moving us? It seems to have something to do with the object. We very often talk about goals moving us to pursue them. What is that? Is it the object of thought just moving us? Or is it something connected with the object of thought, like some further attitude in relation to the object, like a desire or something like that? Well, I'll come back to that question. So we've got the idea of a kind of motivating power to which we are subject that gets us to act. Okay. And then the other idea is this idea of what I call self-determination. Now, I think you can have actions that don't involve self-determination, or we ordinarily think that. I'm driven into performing an action by compulsive fear. I retreat quite deliberately with the goal of getting away from the extremely dangerous-looking snake. But, I mean, it is so terrifying that I'm really not determining for myself what I do. We can have that sort of as a possibility. But many of our actions and our refrainings for action, we think we have some kind of power on our part to determine for ourselves their performance. And our natural understanding of this power involves the idea of freedom as involving alternatives. And freedom in relation to what I say on the board is our outcomes. So this power very often is understood by us, generally is understood by us, as our having some kind of power to do more than one thing. It's up to me, we very often say in English, whether I move away from you or approach you, whether I raise my hand or lower it. And this seems to be a kind of power, up to me-ness, which philosophers call freedom, which involves a power to produce more than one outcome, alternative outcomes. Now here, we've immediately come across an idea of power. That's what self-determination is. And it involves not a relationship between an action and an object, but between us as an agent and the action. And it's not a power that we're subject to, like motivation, but it's a power we immediately think of as being exercised by us over something else, the action. Okay. That's immediately the way we think about it. Of course, philosophers may want to tidy that up in various directions, but that's where we start. And of course, immediately it looks as though we've got rather different kinds of power. One is a power to which we are subject, motivating power, involving a very different, an action, but a very different thing from the agent. It's an object of thought. And the other involves the action, but also involves the agent, and it's a power belonging to the agent, not to which the agent is subject, as we immediately understand it. So you would expect that in the theory of action, any account of agency will give a very different account of the power involved in motivation and the power involved in self-determination. After all, one is a power that we're subject to and involves an object of thought. The other is a power that we ourselves exercise as looks like continuing substances capable of performing actions over the actions. Why should the same theory explain motivation and self-determination? You'd expect two different theories for two very different powers involving two very different things related to action, objects of thought and agents. But in the English language tradition, since Hobbes, we found something rather remarkable. We find exactly the same power being used to explain motivation and being used to explain self-determination. Hobbes himself didn't do that, because Hobbes, I think, was rather realistic about what he was up to, but lots of people after him did. And the power that they appeal to is ordinary causation. It's perfectly ordinary. In this case, it doesn't involve bricks hitting windows. It involves something mental, a motivation in you, a passion or motivation prior to your action, causing you to perform an action. And this idea, what I call voluntariness, is used to explain both purposiveness and, particularly in the English language compatibilist tradition, it's been used also to explain self-determination. So with purposiveness, you have the following picture. I suggested that an action might be a kind of attitude, but after Hobbes, that's not the way people thought at all. They said, no, actions aren't attitudes. They're things like bodily motions that are in themselves completely objectless. You know, my limbs take me across the room, I wave my hand around. I may be doing this as a means to an end, but the action considered in itself is just a contentless bodily motion, doesn't have any object direction in its own right. What makes it an action is that it's produced by prior attitudes that cause it. And to avoid the theory being regressive, those are passive, because they're not actions themselves, they're going to be used to explain what action is. And they have contents, and those contents and their objects provide the action with its goal. So I may, just want to cross the road. So I have a desire, what Davidson calls a pro-attitude, to an object that I cross the road, and then that causes me to cross the road. It causes me to do something voluntarily. And I'm going to talk about voluntariness, as Hobbes talked about it, as doing something on the basis of a pro-attitude of some sort towards doing it. Some kind of motivating psychological attitude in which you respond to an object at the very least as desirable or good. It could be a desire, it could be, from the point of view of this theory, an intention or whatever. They can be quite generous about what pro-attitudes come to, as Davidson himself was. And these pro-attitudes, of course, may be simple. I may just want to do something for its own sake. I want to cross the road, that's all. Or I may want to get to the other side, to the chip shop, to get something to eat, and I believe that if I cross the road, I will again get to the chip shop. And the contents of the desire for the end, combined with the belief as to means, will feed through to give the action that it causes its goal direction. I cross the road not just for its own sake, but as a means to getting to the chip shop the other side. And so goal direction comes from prior causes and involves this phenomenon of voluntariness, doing something as an effect of a pro-attitude towards doing it. Okay. Very, very familiar view of action. It comes up in all sorts of modern writers, not just philosophers of action, but moral philosophers. If someone like Tim Scanlon, if you read his books, talks about actions as expressions of attitudes, he's got this picture. Actions aren't attitudes themselves. They are produced through causation, psychological states in your head, which give the action its object. And then Hobbes thought that's all you need to say about power in relation to action, because there's just this ordinary causal power of passions or appetites, as he calls them. They get you to perform actions. That's it. There's no such thing as self-determination, Hobbes thought, for reasons we're going to come and see. But after Hobbes, people weren't quite so sort of tough as Hobbes himself was. They said, well, we want to hold on to this idea of self-determination, and surely we can't ordinarily have any understanding of it that isn't respectably post-Hobbesian. So we're going to, the only power in nature is ordinary causation, so our understanding of self-determination must be constructed out of ordinary causation. We've already got a power in the story. It's a power of our motivations, passive motivations to cause us to act. We'll just let this power provide us with self-determination as well. And so you get bog standard English language compatibilism. We've got a power over alternatives. Well, that's simple. Power of voluntariness isn't inherently a power over alternatives. You can have a capacity to do one thing on the basis of a motivation to do it, like stay where I am, without necessarily having a capacity to do something else, like moving away on the basis of a motivation. For example, unbeknownst to me, I might be restricted in some way. But we'll turn it into a power involving alternatives by saying freedom, it's up to me whether I do A or not, just comes to the capacity to do A as an effect of being motivated to do A, having a pre-attitude towards doing A, and having a capacity to refrain on the basis of a motivation to refrain. And that's it. That's freedom, that's self-determination. A capacity to act however you want as an effect of wanting to act. And of course, it doesn't raise any problems that we're very familiar with in relation to self-determination with determinism, because you can have that sort of capacity in a deterministic world. Your desire, what desires you actually, or motivations you actually have, is causally determined. But it can still be true that if you'd had other motivations, you'd have had the capacity to satisfy them as well as an effect of having them. Okay. So this is an appeal to ordinary causation that gives the same account of motivation and self-determination, really. It's the same power involved in both cases, and the same bearer of the power, motivation is in your head. Well, obviously, if we're interested in providing an account of how we ordinarily think, we've got a big danger signal here now, because we started off with an idea of two quite distinct powers. One is a power we exercise ourselves to determine for ourselves what we do, and the other is a power to which we're subject, which is a power to be moved into action by something involving an object of thought. And these being rammed together is exactly the same power. But how should a power that we are subject to be a power involved in determining things for ourselves? It doesn't look right. It looks as though we've started changing the subject. And there are further problems with this whole picture. For a start, compatibilism is too obviously true. Now, I'm actually quite neutral about the compatibilist versus incompatibilist problem. This problem about whether self-determination is compatible with causal determinism. I really don't have a view. I used to be a bit of a libertarian, but I've changed. I've become neutral. But I think it's very, very important that this is a matter that we can intelligibly argue about. Does this idea of determining for ourselves what we do permit the power, involve a concept of the power that allows it to exist in a world where our actions are causally predetermined by prior events outside our control? Is that possible? Well, I think a lot of people initially think it's not, but not everyone thinks that, and both positions, the compatibilist and the incompatibilist position, seem to be intelligible. It's not as if one side or the other seems to be radically misunderstanding the problem just by taking a particular view on that question. But this bog standard English language compatibilism makes compatibilism bloody obviously true. It looks as though if that's what all you were thinking about when you think about self-determination, capacity to act as you want, you'd have to be nuts not to be a compatibilist. You'd be involved in some profound inner confusion. But that doesn't look as though people are. at all. And then another thought. We tend to think that the self-determination involves a power to do otherwise that matters to our moral responsibility for what we do. I'm going to come back a little more to that thought. But this power of self-determination bases our capacity to be fairly blamed and held morally responsible for what we do. And it involves a dependence of our moral responsibility for what we do on a freedom to do otherwise, on it's really being up to me whether or not I do one thing or another thing. This power to act otherwise is not irrelevant to self-determination and what it bases. It's very much part of it, and it's essential to moral responsibility. It's very natural to think. We could call this power control and make very evident its involvement of alternatives. And it looks as though our moral responsibility depends on actually being in control of which action we perform. But on this analysis, we've split this single power to produce more than one outcome, what I call a multi-way power. It's a single power that under one and the same set of circumstances could produce more than one outcome, into two distinct cases of power: capacity to do A on the basis of a motivation to do A, and a capacity to refrain on the basis of a motivation to refrain, that are quite distinct from each other. You're only going generally to have one at the same time, unless you're very conflicted, and you're only certainly going to be exercising one power or the other at any one time. You're either going to be doing A or refraining. So the power that you're not exercising, the power to do otherwise, is a dummy. It's not actually involved in anything you actually do. So why should moral responsibility ever depend on it? It's not surprising that the English language post-Hobbesian tradition has been full of people, going back to John Locke, it's not just Harry Frankfurt, who said, I don't think that moral responsibility has anything to do with the freedom to do otherwise. Well, no, of course you don't, because you've already split the power that bases moral responsibility up into two distinct cases of one-way power, where the power to do otherwise is quite distinct from the power to do what you're actually doing. Of course that's going to change the way you think about moral responsibility in a way different from the way we ordinarily think. Again, you may have changed the subject. And then finally, we have the problem that we have a natural conception. People have been discussing about freedom of will as opposed to freedom of action. We don't just think that the actions we perform as means to ends occur as an effect of motivations at the point of bodily movements and the like. We think that some of our motivations are formed through action as well. And not ordinary desires, those look passive, but things like decisions and intentions are motivating attitudes that involve taking a pro-attitude towards an object, what you decide on and intend. But we think that we can determine for ourselves what we decide and intend. And I think we ordinarily think of decisions and intentions as having a purpose or goal, our performance of the action decided upon. And I could say a lot more about why that's probably must be the right way of thinking about them if the question arises further. But they're not obviously voluntary. They're not things that we form as a means to ends in the way that we perform voluntary actions. That is, I don't have desires for ends and then form beliefs about which particular decision or intention would enable me to attain that end, and then form those decisions and intentions on the basis of some prior pro-attitude towards those specific decisions and intentions, like higher order decisions and intentions, so to intend. As Hobbes said, I can act as I will, but I don't will as I will. I don't take higher order decisions. And so a very natural way of looking at the motivation of what I call voluntary actions that clearly are voluntary, like crossing the road or raising my hand, that they're formed on the basis of pro-attitudes towards performing them. That story doesn't really apply to decisions and intentions, which is why, of course, Hobbes used this, what I call voluntariness-based model of action, as a way of saying that decisions and intentions are really passive. They're not actions at all. What's Hobbes up to here? Well, he's wanting to tell a story about motivation that restricts it to ordinary causation. So anything that moves us to perform actions that's to do with the object of the action must be some sort of ordinary cause in our heads, like a prior psychological state. And so he introduces prior content-bearing motivations to provide motivating power through ordinary causation. And he sees that action as something that's motivated always occurs by its very nature as an effect of prior motivating attitudes, which are pro-attitudes towards its performance. So you've got a nice unified theory of motivation which is a story you can't so easily tell about decisions, and so he wants to deny that decisions are actions at all. Before Hobbes, you get a very different kind of theory. You get this theory that I mentioned earlier, actions aren't effects of attitudes by their very nature. They may be effects of attitudes, but that's not what makes them actions. Action primarily occurs as a kind of attitude itself. It's goal-directed, but its goal is provided not by prior causes that move us to perform it through ordinary causation, but by its own object. So, I decide to cross the road, and if I do that for its own sake, it could be that there's nothing else involved except the decision, which is a formation of an intention, and the object, which is internal to the decision, just as the object of a belief might be internal to the belief state, and the object of a desire is internal to the desire state. And what makes the decision an action is having that object and being that kind of attitude to the object. And if there's motivation involved, it's provided by the object itself, or it can be provided by the object itself through some normative property. So the desirability of crossing the road, if it's really desirable, or something more plausible that might be desirable for its own sake, the desirability of surviving or being happy leads me to intend it because that's a desirably, genuinely good or desirable object to aim at. The normative desirability of that object moves me to decide on it, just as the evident truth of another kind of object might move me to believe it. And so associated with this theory of actions as attitudes is a different theory of motivating power, which doesn't appeal to ordinary causation, or something that doesn't look like ordinary causation, because it operates through objects of thought, and it involves normative properties attaching to those objects of thought, like the desirability or goodness of an object. It's worthy of being aimed at. And that moves me to decide on and aim in it. And we've got a way of unpacking a very, very familiar theory of normativity as it involves reason, which is this, that whatever reasons are, and here's something that sort of Christine Korsgaard would, for example, will happily say nowadays, reasons or justifications must be able to move us. Right, they do. They come from normative properties attaching to objects of thought, like evidence of truth or goodness, and they exercise a power over us to which we are susceptible on the basis of our rationality. Now, we don't have ordinary causation moving us here. We've got something very different, a kind of normative power, power of reason. And I think this is what Hume was attacking in the famous discussion of scepticism about practical reason. He wasn't worried about trivial problems to do with whether beliefs can motivate us. He's attacking the idea that we can be moved by a normative power operating through and attaching to objects of thought. But I won't say anything more about that because we can see, though, that different models of what agency is can be associated with very different models, what kind of power is involved in motivation. And it certainly looks as though we ordinarily do think of motivation in terms of other than ordinary causation. Why did you decide on that? Well, it looked a really good idea, it looked a really desirable thing to do. Really, it's good, so I decided on it. I'm not just meaning I happened to want it. It looked genuinely desirable. That's why I started to want it in the first place, for the same reason I just eventually decided on it, because there was a goodness attaching to this possibility which moved me. And I'm sensible, and I'm moved by that sort of thing. I'm not a fool. Only fools are indifferent to this normative power. It only passes them by. Okay, now I want to move from motivation and debates about motivation to self-determination. And we're going to see that we've got a very different way of looking at self-determination from this appeal of voluntariness. Of course, if decisions are actions, but they're not voluntary, they're not things that we take on the basis of pro-attitudes towards taking those decisions as means to various ends, we can't identify self-determination with the power of voluntariness. We'll have to talk about it in other terms. And indeed we do. Why does self-determination matter in ethics? Well, it's a basis of a very distinctive ethical criticism called blame. Now, there are lots of kinds of ethical criticism which I don't think appeal to self-determination. I don't think morality as such requires self-determination. If I say to you, you're a selfish bastard, I'm making an ethical criticism of you, very obviously. But I'm not attributing to you or presupposing any kind of power of self-determination. You could have just been born that way. you're still a selfish bastard, and I'm going to avoid you like the plague, and I disapprove of you. What I'm not doing is blaming you in the way that involves self-determination, which does something more than just find events or states in you, like your motivations. Selfish bastards' motivations are very self-interested, that's the problem. What I do is I detect a fault in your motivations. Well, I've done that already, I've said you're a selfish bastard. And then, and this is essential to moral blame in its full-scale form, I put the faults down to you as your fault. That's a further issue beyond whether you're a selfish bastard, whether it's your fault that you're a selfish bastard. Again, I can criticise you rationally as a fool. You form foolish beliefs. But I'm always asked, is it your fault that you form the foolish beliefs? Are you negligent in your reasoning, inattentive in the logic course? Or were you just born that way because you're just not very rational? This further question, is the irrationality or unreasonableness your fault? That's the question raised in blame, and it involves a problem not about events and states in you and their properties, but something else about your relation to these events and states, not as their possessor, but as a potential determiner of them. The fault is your fault because you have some capacity in your part to determine its occurrence. Otherwise we just go back to criticising you as a bearer of events and states. And the problem about looking at self-determination in terms of voluntariness is you're replacing the idea of the self as determining things with the idea of events and states in you having certain properties. And that's not enough to generate the basis of a distinctive blame criticism. Obviously the selfish bastard acts voluntarily. They're moved into action, voluntary action by their selfish motivations. That's not a basis of the blame criticism. That's just another aspect of being a selfish bastard. They've got events and states in them that have these unpleasant properties. Okay. So, self-determination is a distinctive ethical criticism, and it's distinctive in a way that involves the idea of a power belonging to the self to determine their events and states and not just possess them, or not just suffer their effects. Okay. That's absolutely fundamental about it. Hobbes didn't think that we have this power to determine for ourselves what events and states we possess, so he denied that self-determination is possible. And he is involved in a radical series of criticisms of the very possibility of self-determination on that basis. Now, a lot of modern scepticism about self-determination, and there's a lot of it in modern free will literature, certainly in English, very often works this way. It assumes something like incompatibilism, and then says, because incompatibilism is true, freedom is impossible. Galen Strawson is essentially in that game, and people will appeal to something like Hume. Liberty, by removing necessity, so we're understanding liberty in a way that's incompatibilist, it's incompatible with necessitating or determining causes, removes also causes, and is the very same thing with chance. So you thought by removing ordinary causation, you were left with, you made room for a power, but actually you got rid of power altogether. I'm agnostic about incompatibilism, so I don't find that scepticism so interesting, so I'm happy to discuss it. I find very interesting Hobbes' scepticism, which isn't based on incompatibilism at all. It's based on a very different claim, which is this: there can only be one kind of power in nature, it's ordinary causation. And the trouble with self-determination is that whatever it involves, it's clearly not ordinary causation, so it can't exist. And that's the burden of the whole debate with Bramall, a famous discussion on the questions concerning liberty, necessity and chance. And it's a very, very acute critique of the very idea of self-determination from the point of view that the only kind of power that can exist in nature is ordinary causation. And it develops in the following way. Hobbes sees, and his target is really Suarez, not Bramall, but we needn't go into the history. We see that my opponents think that under one and the same circumstances, it cannot be up to me whether I raise my hand or lower it. I can have a power to determine either that my hand goes up or that it stays down under one and the same circumstances. That's the idea of freedom in relation to outcomes. Now, what's wrong with this idea? Well, it's not just the idea of multi-wayness, the idea that you've got a power that under given set of circumstances could produce more than one outcome, because I think you could have that with something like probabilistic causation. One particle could have under one and the same circumstances the power to accelerate another particle but there's a possibility of various different kinds of rates of acceleration being produced. So it's a single power to accelerate, which could produce more than one effect, different rates of acceleration. Well, I think that's possible. I mean, Hobbes didn't let it in because he was a determinist, but we needn't be that. We needn't be determinists. We could allow for probabilistic causation. But that, we'd end up with sort of a multi-way power that can influence the rate of acceleration without determining it. That, I don't think, would be a problem for Hobbes, really. I had to get rid of the determinism, but that's not so. What he's objecting to is that under one and the same set of circumstances, I can determine alternative outcomes. So it's not just that I sit here like a probabilistic cause influencing whether my hand goes up or down, with the outcome remaining deeply dependent to a degree on chance. It's up to me whether my hand goes up or down. I can determine it for myself. That means that under one and the same circumstances, I have a power that can operate to produce more than one outcome with, given the exercise of the power, no further dependence of the outcome on chance. I can remove any further involvement of chance. I can settle the matter. And Hobbes says that's not possible. Think of how we think about ordinary causation. I claim to you that this brick has, under these circumstances, when I throw it at the window, I'm very specifying, no one's intervening, God isn't going to come and save the window, has the power to determine the window breaks. And Hobbes is going to say, right, mate, okay, let's see, chuck it at the window and let's see if it breaks. And if it doesn't, then it clearly doesn't, under those circumstances, have the power to determine the window breaks, because its possession of the power, under the circumstances it's supposed to possess it, nothing gets in the way, must guarantee the outcome's production if it's a power to determine. Now we see the problem with power to determine alternative outcomes. What Suarez calls a way of determination that belongs to what he called free causation. I'm going to call it contingent determination. You can have the power to determine more than one outcome under one and the same circumstances, with nothing intervening in the way. It's entirely open to you to exercise it. For you to be able to determine alternative outcomes, it must be possible to possess that power and not produce the outcome. And Hobbes says, but that's not possible. We don't understand that as a power to determine at all. As he says, but that the indetermination, which he's talking about this idea of contingent determination, can make it happen or not happen is absurd. For indetermination maketh it equally to happen or not to happen, and therefore both, which is a contradiction. Therefore indetermination doth nothing, and whatsoever causes do is necessary. So he's saying that you are committed, if we think about the power in a coherent way, to a mysterious kind of power that, because it's determining, must actually produce the outcome where the power is present, but must be able to produce inconsistent outcomes. But that's impossible. So piss off. It doesn't exist. And then he says it's worse now. Because think of this power that can produce alternatives. How do we relate to it? I've been talking about freedom as alternatives in relation to outcomes. But the notion of freedom, and Hobbes is very sensitive to this, comes back into our thoughts when we think about not the power's relation to outcomes, but our relation to the power. Because if I say to you, well, look, you've got this power to determine alternative outcomes, it's up to you what you do. So we can think about the power in relation to the outcomes. It's a power to produce or even determine more than one outcome. What's your relationship as the bearer to this power? Is it just fixed how the power is going to operate, like with an ordinary cause? Well, clearly not, because otherwise I wouldn't have the power I wouldn't be in a position to exercise the power to produce more than one outcome. Okay, so is it just random how the power is going to operate, as with a probabilistic cause? Well, no. I'm immediately going to say, look, it's not random, and it's not just fixed by the very nature of the power how it's going to operate. It's up to me whether the power is exercised to produce one outcome, that my hand goes up, or another outcome, that my hand stays where it is. And then Hobbes says, now we've got a really nasty theory, because we're introducing the idea of freedom, which is the very kind of power we were trying to understand and explain, at another level up. Not to relate the power to outcomes, but to relate you as possessor of the power to the power itself. And that's regressive, viciously regressive, because to exercise the power, we're going to have to exercise a power of freedom over the power, and then to do that, we're going to have to, etc., etc., as Hobbes says. And if a man determine himself, the question will still remain what determined him to determine himself in that manner. Now, we've got here an argument that I don't think assumes incompatibilism in any way. It assumes that all that can exist is ordinary causation. And ordinary causation seems to operate the following sort of way in our heads, in the way we think about it. It can either be really powerful, it can determine outcomes, and then it's fixed how it operates. Given the circumstances in which the power is present with its bearer, if it's really a power to determine, it must produce the outcome. It's a bit like a cog. It plays its part in the whole system. It must, once it's present, be exercised to produce the outcome determined. Otherwise, it's not a power to determine. Or it's merely a power to influence, and then it's a lesser case of power. It's just, the probabilistic cause has a diminished influence over the rate of acceleration compared to a determining cause in relation to the rate of acceleration. It can't determine what the acceleration is, it merely influences it and leaves the final acceleration a bit to chance. Well, we've got an idea of freedom as leaving outcomes open by its very nature, but not just simply as a power to influence because of that. It's still a power to determine. So it combines determining power with not being cog-like. It's open to the bearer how it operates. It's up to us how we exercise the power. We are determining outcomes for ourselves. And of course, that's what Hume was really denying. He wasn't actually relying on incompatibilism. He was saying, if we understand power properly, we take away necessity, we take away the predetermination of how the power will actually operate, then we won't have determination left at all. We'll just have chance, dependence and chance. That's not the way we wouldn't really think. Now I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Professor Pink. I now invite Dr. Christian Weidemann from the University of Innsbruck for a response.
When preparing a commentary, two things are helpful. The first one is if you really hate the paper, because then you want to kill it, you want to if you fundamentally disagree with it, and unfortunately, I happen to agree about very much. And the second thing which is really helpful in commenting a paper is if you actually do know something about the debate. And unfortunately, I do not. I'm not really an expert. And I think it was an extremely rich talk. And the book and the book chapter I've read were even richer. So I have to focus on some things. And leave it to the experts to make maybe some deeper objections. Just to make sure that I understood anything correctly, I think we have two very important notions: the notion of action, the notion of power. Action is something done for a purpose in order to attain the goal. This is purposelessness. And the power is the capacity to produce or to outright determine the occurrence or non-occurrence of outcomes. And Tom's main thesis is that we have two different kinds of action involving two different kinds of power. We have voluntary actions, that is actions that we can perform on the basis or moved by a prior desire or decision. And here we have ordinary causal powers, the power of motivations to cause the actions motivated, or maybe in other cases the decisions that cause the chosen actions. But this is not something where free will comes in. The place of free will is in determining the decision itself. So you can call it action of the will, or and action of the will has something to do with normativity, with reasons. There's a formulation in the book, is to exercise our rationality or our capacity for reason, but in a practical or action constitutive way. What is also constitutive for this kind of this. This is maybe the most controversial thesis of Tom, and here is a non-causal power involved. So you can of course ask whether this is even intelligible, but I will not go into that. And this non-causal power of freedom, there are these classic up-to-usness control over which actions we perform. That there's a power over alternatives and so on. This is also constitutive of this non-causal power of freedom. Okay. Now some three objections. The first thing you might ask is why Tom thinks that desires need not play any role in actions, need not play any role for free will. And one of his arguments, he was not part of your talk, is something like that. So if desires were to play a role, there would be something very puzzling, namely that certain desires can just destroy human freedom. Let's say these compulsory desires, like fear, if you have a phobia in front of snakes, or if you are addicted to alcohol or drugs. These kind of very strong desires actually destroy human freedom. And this is a quote. He remarks, unlike decisions, desires are passive occurrences, things that come over us without being directly our own doing, and that leaves desires as threats to our freedom and not sources of it. Okay, I think that there's something fishy with this kind of argument, because you can have the same kind of argument with respect to reasons. You can say you need some rationality, but not too much of it. So think about I'm deliberating whether to procrastinate or to finish the stamped paper. The deadline is usually a few months ago, and if I were perfectly rational, it were not up to me whether to procrastinate or to finish the paper. The rational thing is to finish the paper. So it seems that why is it an argument against the thesis that desires play a necessary role in our actions, that too strong desires are detrimental to human freedom, and why is not the same kind of argument applied with respect to reasons? And there, of course, we all agree. I think we all agree that rationality is an essential part of decision making. Okay, that's my first objection. I now want to try to argue for some strength in the Hobbesian account, namely that it is unifying, that it gives a unifying picture of freedom and of action, and as well as regarding God and animals. Let's suppose the following argument. I think prima facie freedom is a great making property. That is a property that, ceteris paribus, it is always better to have than not to have. So if a human being lacks freedom, we normally pity her, and it's not a good thing to lack good freedom. But according to Tom's account, God lacks this kind of freedom, because God is perfectly rational, and it's not up to God whether to torture little children or not to. So God lacks this kind of freedom, and therefore God lacks a great making property, which seems to be absurd. and compare this with other accounts of freedom. Hobbes is only one example. You can also take, for example, Richard Swinburne's account or the Kantian account, which do not have this consequence. For Hobbes, someone is free who is not hindered to do what he has a will to do. And according to this definition, no problem pops up. God is perfectly free in this sense. There's no one who is more free. He's absolutely free in this sense. There's no one who's superior in this regard to God. And that's one thing. But what's also true is that Hobbes can claim that there's only a difference in degree between us and animals. And maybe there's something to be said for that. Huh? Suppose we are all products of evolution and so on, so there might be a case for thinking that there's only a gradual difference, and that the dolphins and bonobos and so on have also some kind of free will. And Hobbes can account for that, but you don't. So I think I'm not saying that I'm really convinced by this objection, but I think at least it's a virtue of the Hobbesian account, and maybe a disadvantage of yours. My last objection, which has to do that I prepared the talk mainly by reading this book. And in this book, Tom sells his theory as a way to defend libertarianism. Okay, he later, and I doubt that this is really of so much help to defend libertarianism. You need something more, and this, because I think you underestimate this randomness objection or this luck objection. And I don't know whether I should go into this thought experiment, which is well known, and we talked about it in passing yesterday about it. But okay, the problem of randomness pops up even if you introduce some non-causal powers or an agent cause in another way. You can imagine that Alice is confronted with a choice between lying and telling the truth, and she tells the truth, and then God or evil demon caused the universe to revert in time to precisely its state 1 minute before, and then Alice is in the same situation, let's say 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times, and so on. And of course, because we assume incompatibilism and libertarianism, and there are no truth values to counterfactuals of freedom. We don't know for sure what she will do, but we can have expectations, and it's very probably that the ratio of the outcome of truth saying and lying will converge to a certain value. And then we have supposedly some kind of objective probability which you can attribute even to the individual decisions. And this seems to, then we have again this randomness problem, and the introduction of non-causal powers is of no help here, I think. Okay, that's it.
Christian, thank you for those very penetrating and challenging objections. I'm not going to be able to answer them completely because we wouldn't have time for further questions, but I'll just talk about them very quickly in each case. Are desires not essential for freedom? Why desires might not be essential for freedom? I might have in the past used simply the argument that desire can destroy freedom. I think that's a bit weak. You're quite right. I think it's going to be an empirical question. What can destroy freedom? I'm not going to make any a priori assumptions about what can destroy freedom. Well, not very many compared to, say, a lot of people who are libertarians. I'm certainly not going to assume that prior passive motivations, if they're action determining, must destroy freedom. I think it's just very important that it's intelligible to see them as potential threats to freedom in the way we think about freedom. And that means that something like the bog standard Hobbesian story is very, very immediately implausible, which is why it gets so much resistance when you give introductions to free will courses to undergraduates. I think that the question of what destroys freedom is not a conceptual question, because none of the attempts to solve it conceptually, whether from the compatibilist side or the incompatibilist side, in the direction of establishing either incompatibilism or compatibilism, have worked. I don't think consequence argument works. David Lewis was right, but it doesn't. I think compatibilist conceptual arguments try to reduce freedom to something else, as post-Hobbesians did. They don't work terribly well. I think what we need to do is to give an account of what freedom is that makes it intelligible that the issue should be conceptually open. And that's not an issue where I presented the problem in that little paperback 10 years ago, and that was my fault. I've reformed. And you're right that the same problem can arise with reason. Because if you look at the medieval tradition, when you have more than one kind of power productive of action, you have more than one kind of free will problem. You can have a problem about efficient causation and its implications for our freedom to do otherwise. And then you can have a problem about final causation, which is one of the ways they tend to conceive of normative power coming from objects, of the working of rationality. You can have a problem about whether final causation can remove freedom. You know, in the beatific vision in heaven, we are presented by this object that is infinitely good. And people in the Thomists and other traditions very often see this is an offer we will not be free to refuse. But it will determine us through the object, through a normative power, not as an efficient cause, on some views at any rate. So I think there are very interesting parallels between the two problems. Okay. Secondly, can freedom be a great-making property? This is a really interesting question. I think it can, even as a power over alternatives, because it can exist in a perfectly virtuous being as a power to do alternatives by way of the good. The way it exists in us, in a way that it doesn't exist in God, is what Augustine called the libertas minor, where we have the freedom to do the bad things. And that God doesn't probably have, at any rate, not in my view, at any rate. So we don't want the libertas minor being a great-making property. And of course, the very title, libertas minor, by comparison to the libertas major of heaven, tells you that it's not going to be. But there's a further complication. I think that a lot of the way we think about freedom as a perfection is not immediately an idea about power over alternatives, but an idea of an ethical condition that is about the perfection of the power. It's what I call liberation. The idea of the libertas major is as much a theory of liberation as an ethical state, as a theory of power. And I think a full account of freedom as a perfection will have to give an account of various ways of thinking about freedom as the name of a power, as the name of a right, the right to freedom, and as the name of an ethically desirable state, conditioned liberation. And obviously I can't do that now. Finally, I will say, metaphysical uniformity of the sort that Hobbes is out. Is that a good thing? Well, Hobbes thought it was, but then he wasn't trying to give what I'm really concerned to give, I think, an account of our everyday ethical thought that he claimed to. And of course, it may be an important aspect of our everyday ethical thought that we don't treat animals as continuous with us for certain reasons. And then, of course, if we're going to give an account of the content of our ordinary ethical thought, uniformity might not be a plus. Of course, it might be a plus for the metaphysical theory. That's another issue. And finally, does my theory help defend libertarianism? It makes libertarianism an intelligible position. Now, these Luck cases are really complex, and I still don't know fully what I think about them. I think they very often worry event-causal libertarians much more than they worry me. Because what I'm about is finding a power in us that can base a very distinctive criticism, which puts events and states that are faulty in us down to us as our fault. And it can perfectly well be chancy how we exercise that power, but provided we have it, then it can base the ethical criticism. Problem about this story about Alice, it's not there. All we've got are prior event causes by implication and probabilities about what outcomes they will lead to. And it looks as though the agent has disappeared. I'm trying to put the agent back by bringing in a distinctive power of the agent. And I'm not worried if that power is causally undetermined in many cases. But of course, I'm not trying to establish libertarianism through appeal to this power. I'm merely making it an intelligible theoretical option. I'll say in discussion more if people want to know how I think you to try and establish libertarianism and why we have libertarian or incompatibilist intuitions. And there I'll stop.